Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guests today are Merissa Khurma and Alex Farley. Merissa is program manager for the Wilson Center's Middle East program, and Alex serves as program and research associate with that same program. They join us today to talk about a study they've been conducting about the workforce in the Middle East and what are some of the implications of the current COVID-19 pandemic on the workforce as we look ahead. Merissa, Alex, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John, for having us.
Thanks, John.
So one of the blurbs in your literature says the workforce challenge is among the most complex and urgent socioeconomic and political challenges facing the region. Merissa, let me get you to expand on that. Explain what the implications are.
Thank you, John. So it is the most complex, both socioeconomically and politically, precisely because economic stability or economic instability leads to political instability. We've seen so many protests during the Arab uprisings, but as recent as last year as well, from Algeria to Sudan to Iraq and Lebanon, that are very much driven by socioeconomic conditions on the ground that have been very challenging for the people of the region, with very low, very high unemployment rates, very high poverty rates, and decreasing foreign direct investments, stagnated growth due to internal and external factors. So it is a very complex issue, and our premise in the study and in the initiative in general is that economic development, and particularly addressing the workforce challenge in the region, is a key pillar to economic and political stability and contributes to also preventing violent extremism.
And we'll dig into some of that, Merissa. But first, I want to ask Alex just to give us a little peek behind the curtain. Talk about the study you've been conducting, how you've been doing it, and what are some of the things you've been looking at.
Yeah, John, I think there's three things to consider. First is the demographic issue. So you've seen the youth populations grow and grow in a lot of countries in the region. And that's conflicting with the economic capacity to actually hire this surplus workforce. So, you look at the demographic pyramid in places like Tunisia, it has expanded considerably. And then states responded by providing more education opportunities and higher education and vocational training. But it didn't match with the right economic reforms to integrate the private sector into that process of change. And so you see is the provision of a lot of static certifications, a lot of traditional ones that weren't really updated to the type of economies that these countries were trying to pursue in the 90s and the early 2000s. So I think one way that we characterized it is that these two forces are kind of colliding, they're clashing. And then that has resulted in a few interesting paradoxes. First of all, youth unemployment is very high, which is a common feature in the developing world. But there's also a particular phenomenon of high unemployment among university educated graduates, which is affecting apparently the Middle East region more than others.
Why is that? What is happening? Is it just the status of the global job market?
So let me jump in a little bit just to sort of define the issue, and then Alex can go into more details. So to make it a little bit more easier for our readers and our audience to understand why we have this workforce challenge, we've sort of defined this workforce challenge as a formula of both supply and demand. So on the supply side, as Alex insinuated, there are many jobs that go unfulfilled because of the skills mismatch. Everyone we talk to in the region, as well as in Washington, involved in economic development in the Middle East and North Africa region, basically said that there's a skills mismatch across the region. There's a deficit of essential skills that are needed by the market. Those who are graduating from tertiary education basically do not have the necessary skills to enter the job market. And then Alex mentioned technical and vocational training. He's more of an expert on this. I'll let him talk about it a little bit later. And then on the demand side, it's the private sector that basically is too small. SMEs face growth constraints. They don't have access to finance. have a lack of available liquidity. There are efforts to try to encourage entrepreneurship, but in most cases, they don't have access to markets. So it is a very challenging situation. And so that's sort of how we defined the problem. Alex,
Yeah,
do you want to?
what caught my attention, Alex, and I have to say thank you for that, Merissa. What caught my attention when you talked about university educated people
Yeah.
struggling in the work, that's a bit of a surprise, especially when on the supply side that Merissa described, she talks about the education system. But you brought up, Merissa, this notion of a mismatch. Is that what we're talking about here, Alex? It's not that people aren't getting an education, they're getting the wrong education?
I think that's right. And Marissa added very important context to establish the fact that there aren't enough jobs going around. But one of the interesting aspects of the paradox is sometimes even the private sector will turn over or reject people with university educations because they don't have the right skills. So the idea of the skills mismatch is really important to really signal the fact that the type of education or the pedagogical approaches or the traditions or the standards haven't been updated in a way that the private sector really wants. And just to add to what Marissa said and add some historical caveats, like you also have economies in the region transitioning from primarily government and state employed workforces to the private sector. So there you see that maybe that method of training that workforce hasn't really transitioned to that future development model that countries in the region really want. So there really is a need to update educational approaches in the region.
And
So I'm sorry, go ahead, Marissa.
No, and I want to jump in here because this transition from public sector employment to the private sector may have sort of began, with an effort by the government to basically limit public sector employment, but the mindsets have not changed. People still prefer that their children and their kids basically get public sector employment. There's more stability, there's more status and prestige, even though they're not lucrative jobs. It was so fascinating to talk to some private sector leaders in the region who were losing excellent employees with very high salaries in comparison to basically the average salaries to the public sector once an opening happens because of family pressure and these social mindsets that basically put so much importance to public sector employment and working with the government in general. So these mindsets issues really have to be addressed, probably through the education system.
With that in mind, which is the tougher nut to crack? Are the problems more on the technical side of the equation or on the attitudinal side?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'll just take a stab at that first. I think we've addressed this question in multiple different ways. On the one hand, the preference of youth to go into the public sector, but also things like attitudes that affect the entry of women into the workforce. Like it's really hard to say that there is any source other than cultural and social attitudes. So in that way, maybe that's the tougher nut to crack, in the sense that you need a very broad program and very sweeping cultural change that's not easy to implement from just a government directive. Needs to be very long. But there is also a lot of technical questions on how do you adjust the education system, can incorporate some of these attitudes, can also help change mindsets, but also, and I just wanted to add one quick clarifying point on the skills mismatch, is often we're referring to, and we mentioned this in the report, is what a lot of people are calling soft skills, like things like management, time management, dedication to purpose. And we list some of the ones that we heard most frequently, not in any specific order, but ones that we felt are very important. That's what people aren't getting, and that's what the private sector really wants in order to be adaptable and have very productive employees. So the tougher nut maybe to crack maybe be the cultural question, but there are also very big hurdles to cross with the reform side.
And with the reform side, particularly on like the skilling and reskilling or upskilling, preparing youth for the workforce, particularly with these, soft / we call them essential skills because we don't want to diminish their importance by just calling them soft skills, is that, the government is already constrained, already bloated. does not have the capacity to train youth on some of these skills. The private sector, unfortunately, does not see their role as, you know, basically the primary trainers for youth coming into the labor force. So, of course, there are some companies and some sectors that are leading differently. There are some educational institutions that are also setting examples. In Tunisia, Esprit University, in Jordan, Luminous University, they're really trying to focus on the essential skills so that youth graduate well-rounded and ready to tackle the challenges that come, and basically, you know, address what skills are needed by the private sector. But we still have a very long way to go to make sure that others also in the private sector feel that they should invest in youth because they will benefit in the long term, but they don't see the long-term value of it yet.
So we have a youth bulge. We have cultural barriers to women participating. We have slow growth. We have a mismatch within the education system. We have some infrastructure questions both on the government side and the private sector side. And then ladled on top of all of this, you have a global pandemic. And your work on these issues began before that happened.
Yeah.
What has been the impact of COVID-19 on this whole equation? I mean, the obvious would be that it's just made a bad situation worse.
Right.
But is there more that you can add to that?
So the challenge with COVID-19 is that we're already seeing very high unemployment recorded in the first quarter in many of the countries in the region, particularly amongst the young graduates. In countries like Tunisia and Lebanon, we've seen protests that are completely driven by the lack of jobs and primarily by, you know, labor unions and youth. So this is going to be a very difficult period for the region because the public sector, which is, as we said, the preferred path for many of the youth, is already bloated. It's already spent tons of resources on trying to mitigate or contain the COVID-19 risk. And so the public sector will not be able to hire anymore, right? They've already sort of had put limits on that prior to the pandemic. The private sector, which is primarily comprised of small and medium businesses, has also contracted. The informal sector, which in countries like Tunisia comprises like more than 35%, is completely wiped out. In a country like Jordan, it's as low as 20%, but still, they're suffering. So we are going to see many more job losses, higher poverty, and a constrained private sector. So it's this next period is really going to be tough for the youth of the region in particular.
And to add a little bit to that, the point about informality is really important because so many people are employed in the informal sector, and we're already talking about how a lot of the burden of the policies to prevent spreading the virus have fallen on small businesses.
Yeah.
In the region, things like lockdowns and mobility restrictions really impact people who are informally employed because they have no other protections. Really, they don't have savings accounts and they don't have benefits, and they really rely on state support in addition to their informal work to make income. So it's going to be interesting to see how those people will probably return to formal employment. More people will probably go into informal employment to make ends meet. So it will have a really big impact on the efforts to get things more formal and get businesses registered and with state enterprises.
So where do we begin? If you could manipulate one aspect of the problem to generalize, where could you get the most traction? And are there any initiatives that you could point to that are the most provide the most optimism?
That's a really good question, John, particularly as many of these countries are still grappling with the pandemic, as well as, you know, some political instability. So what they need to do in terms of economic and political reforms that are needed to sort of unlock the potential in addressing some of the structural challenges in the economy, those we already know. the development community has been talking about these for many, many years. Some reforms have taken place, not enough. Sometimes the implementation is the problem. I think this is an opportunity for many governments to really speed up this reform process, change legislations, and really start getting back to work, because it's an opening to rebuild, and also an opening to see, well, what sectors are going to become irrelevant. I mean, we've been talking about the future of work and the impact of 4IR. Well, now we have another disruption, the pandemic. So let's focus on the sectors that will actually see more traction in the future, given the challenges. So I think it's a unique opportunity to really start focusing on an aggressive economic agenda that requires drastic changes in legislation, but also the structure of the economy.
I think Marissa's right, and I'll just add, in the very, very short term, I think that a lot of countries have made wise choices in terms of investing directly in social programs rather than offering jobs, which has been the reaction in the past. So support the most vulnerable first. And these countries are all facing extremely high budget constraints. So they know that they need to do something. And then Marissa's point is very important. The next thing that these countries need to do is focus their future reform efforts on skills and education, and particularly skills, because this is going to give them the key to access those future markets and future jobs that are going to help strengthen their economies and make them more resilient in the future. So they need to open up their business sectors to those, and they need to double their efforts into those new economic sectors. And we're seeing initiatives like this prior to the pandemic, particularly in the Gulf, of emphasizing digital skills. This is going to be a huge thing going forward, and a lot of countries know that this is a big part of the future. So the rest of the region needs to take heed of that and also find a way of integrating that more deeply into how youth are prepared to enter the world of work.
And a very minor and simple example that could really illustrate this. So one of the policies that is recommended to address the low female labor participation in the region is basically enacting flexible hours and just flexibility for women to also work from home. Well, guess what? The pandemic has changed that now. So for many employers who basically rejected that idea in the first place, now this is the reality. This is how we do work today. So this is one thing that could easily be, adopted by governments, and particularly with women. I mean, the World Bank calls this the MENA paradox, the low female labor participation in the region, because women are outperforming men in tertiary education in many sectors, including STEM, much higher rates than here in the United States. But they're not entering the job market, or if they enter, they are they leave because of different social and some of these technical pressures and challenges. So this is a very minor example of how we're going to have to adapt to a new work reality, and hopefully we'll have more women being able to log on from home and work from home. So that's just like one minor example.
Well, it could end up being major, right? This could be a trend.
Right.
If necessity is the mother of invention, and we're all learning what it means to work from home.
Right.
Perhaps that creates an opening. Before we end, we're recording our discussion a couple days before International Youth Day. Yes. And I know you have some things coming up. Talk about, in terms of resources, people who are interested in learning more, what do you have available and where can they find it?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. So the United Nations every year on August 12th commemorates youth and the challenges that they face. So this year, I think the theme is about public engagement or global public engagement. So we've reached out to a few young entrepreneurs and activists in the region to basically write blogs about how they see their role contributing to their communities, from Lebanon to Yemen, to Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, Morocco. So we will be publishing a series on International Youth Day. This is though primarily focused on women, because we're also trying, as part of the Women's Initiative at the Middle East Program, to elevate the voices of women. And John, you and I have talked about this in other interviews. But I think, going back to the workforce issue, we hope to do a lot more host more policy discussions to focus on the issue of skills, youth, and education, and not only hear from those experts in the field, but actually get voices of youth who are trying to basically create their own entities and organizations and enterprises to address the challenge that they're facing. There are, budding entrepreneurs. There are efforts in the region to try to push them, forward and provide an enabling environment. They still face, problems with accessing finance, accessing markets, accessing mentorship and guidance sometimes, but there are colossal efforts that have to be commended. So that's that we hope to sort of focus on in the next period.
Marissa,
There are
Alex.
big projects.
Alex, go ahead. I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
Sorry, John. Sorry to cut you off,
No,
but I think
that's okay.
there are big providers and projects in the region that can connect some of those voices more efficiently here in DC, so people particularly interested in investing can also hear them. I'm thinking of Education for Employment and Amities. They all have programs to support youth and entrepreneurs, specifically in the realm of skills. And so some of these projects we can hopefully uplift some of those best practices and share them with people in this policy community so they know how to approach this issue in the region going forward, especially when, as we hope, those efforts accelerate.
Right.
Alex, Marissa, thank you very much for sharing with us today, and continued success with this terrific work that you're doing, important work that you're doing. And we'll look forward to hearing more about it and seeing more of what you've got in the coming months.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
And to our viewers, thank you for joining us. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.